Hey guys, I just wanted to jump on and welcome our new subscribers and kind of give you an overview of the channel. So what we do here is we use prophecy and history to be a resource for those evaluating the Christian faith. And we strive to offer well-supported, concrete evidence to build our faith on. Now we focus on the first century because there's a lot of fulfilled prophecy and available historical documentation to evaluate. And we do this from a perspective called partial preterism. Preterism is from the Latin word praeter, which just means past. We see most New Testament prophecies as having a past fulfillment toward the end of Jesus' generation. And in just a second, I'll show you exactly why. Most will only have been exposed to a futurist perspective. As the name implies, futurists see most New Testament prophecies awaiting to be fulfilled in our future. I'll quickly share the framework we use and why we don't take a completely futurist perspective. And hopefully it'll serve as a reference to help those unfamiliar with the view get their bearings. And so these are deeply held beliefs, so don't be surprised if there's a lot of passionate discussion in the comment sections of these videos. But our commitment is not to present anything that doesn't have scriptural support and historical reference. But that passion is expected and friendly debate is welcome. That challenge is sometimes how we learn. Most partial preterists were futurists at some point in our lives, so we know how jarring and disorienting it can be to hear some of these things for the first time. So here's the framework. The New Testament is set here, the generation just before the fall of Jerusalem. Now this was a pivotal generation and we detail why in other videos. But let's get straight to the most important point. We show the second coming of Christ happened when he said it would, at the end of his generation, at the time of the Great Tribulation. And we show this Great Tribulation was the first Jewish-Roman war. His first coming was to that generation of Israel, and in context, his second coming was also to that generation of Israel. And that's not meant to be sensational or provocative. We see the tribulation and second coming as past simply because that's where the Bible places it, and there are historical references for it. So if you're considering the timeline, that puts us in what the Bible calls the millennium, prior to the Battle of Gog and Magog, between the first and second resurrections. So we do affirm the creed that he ascended to heaven and is seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. From there he will come to judge the living and the dead. This future judgment and resurrection would be the great white throne judgment and second resurrection as outlined in Revelation chapter 20. So that means the kingdom already started. And many have a particular view of what they think this kingdom should look like. But the Bible text is clear on when it would start and defined it as people from all nations worshiping the God of Israel through Christ. From the 12 disciples to now millions around the world, we wouldn't be worshiping the God of Israel through Christ if he were not currently on the throne. We live in a world that's influenced and shaped by his life, his teachings, and the actions of his followers. So because we see that tribulation is past, you'll recognize that we see the bulk of Revelation, which prophesies this tribulation and second coming to Israel, as having a past fulfillment. And some might say, how could the book of Revelation have any fulfillment at the fall of Jerusalem when it was written after the fall of Jerusalem? Well, many aren't aware there are two historical traditions regarding the dating of Revelation. One dating it before the fall of Jerusalem, one dating it afterwards. Scholars Ken Gentry and Bruce Gore are good references to learn more about the dating of Revelation prior to the fall of Jerusalem. Gentry has a book called Before Jerusalem Fell, where he goes through those historical sources, and Gore has an excellent verse-by-verse study on Revelation on YouTube. But one thing to consider is if Revelation were written after the fall of Jerusalem, the book ceases to have very much meaning because these were things that would soon take place. And nothing aligning with those symbols happened shortly after that mid-90s AD date. That's why we're still trying to match them to world events today. The best fit for the text is that it was written prior to the fall of Jerusalem, and the fall of Jerusalem and the end of the Jewish nation is that cataclysmic event that they were prophesying. So here's why we take a partial preterist view. Taking a futurist view requires a few props or scaffolding to hold the second coming as outlined in the Olivet Discourse, to hold that in the future. First, we have to say the kingdom was postponed when Christ was rejected by Israel, and an unannounced, unprophesied church age was introduced into the plan. Then we go into Daniel and we move the feet of the statue into the future, along with the 11 kings of the final beast. This gap in time needs to be fulfilled by adding new kingdoms or recasting Daniel's kingdoms as more recent ones. We say things like Rome never ended, or the Germanic tribes overran Rome and then became the European nations which now continue to represent Rome. Or we say it's not about Babylon and Persia, it's actually about America, China, Russia. All of these are just devices to extend the prophecy into our future. But his prophecy was pretty simple. He said, count 4 kingdoms and count 11 kings. These were the 4 kingdoms that reigned over Judah in succession, and the 11 kings were the 11 leaders within Rome from the annexation of Judea in 63 BC to the fall of Jerusalem, with the war ending in 73 AD. So we have to pause to think about how amazing it is to have God, through Daniel, tell us about the movement of kings within a kingdom hundreds of years before it happened. But then we have to move to Daniel's famous 70 weeks prophecy. And most will know that a week here is just a set of 7 years. So we're talking 70 sets of 7. And we won't go into detail here, but the prophecy lands in the 1st century. And from the text of the prophecy, we can see the tribulation there. But because we think the tribulation is in the future, we have to disconnect the final set of 7 from the rest and move it into our future. And you'll hear much discussion in futurist circles about Daniel's 70th week. And it was important. It's just not in our future. There's a video on the channel detailing the 70 weeks prophecy, but for now, let's take a look at the scope of the prophecy Daniel gave. He says 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city. And its end, the city's end, will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. So we have to notice that the scope doesn't go beyond the end of the city. The end being spoken here is not the end of time. It's the end of the city, the temple, the old covenant. That age was coming to an end. So moving a week out of this stated scope and putting it into our future is to take it completely out of its original context. And then, because we've disconnected the events from the historical context, we have to introduce a character called the Antichrist, a coming world leader who does everything these original prophecies said would happen. However, he's cast in the future, and he becomes the thread that holds it all together. And finally, Jesus' statement in Matthew 24 and all the other versions of the Olivet Discourse regarding the timing of his coming. Jesus gave the apostles a list of signs that will lead up to the end of the age. Again, not the end of the world, the end of the age. The King James Version used to translate the Greek word aeon there as world, leading most, logically, to think Matthew 24 was speaking of the end of the world. However, Jesus told them, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." So this was not speaking of the end of the world. And skeptics usually say Christ, Paul, and others thought the world would end at the end of that generation and they missed it. But that wasn't what they were prophesying. They were only looking for the changing of the age. That would be a major judgment on Judah and the start of the kingdom. But back to that list of signs, from a purely futurist view, we would say it wasn't about Jesus' generation. It was about the generation who sees the signs. That generation will not pass away. The only problem is the 1st century generation saw all those signs. So they are the generation he was referencing. And they're the generation in the complete context of the Gospels. It's the same generation he was speaking to in Matthew 23 when he said, "Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you will fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." The generation in scope is the you he was speaking to there. He doesn't change generations in the very next chapter. He was still speaking of the same generation. And many today are looking forward to an abomination that causes desolation standing in the temple or in the holy place. They hypothesize that we need a 3rd temple for this to happen. But the desolation of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple were the specific desolation the abomination would precede. We just saw that in Daniel chapter 9. This already happened in the temple that stood in their day. The same temple Jesus had just told the disciples would be torn down with not one stone left upon another. So if you find yourself adding 2,000 years between Daniel's 69th and 70th week, or adding Islam to Daniel's kingdoms or a particular church to those kingdoms, or recasting the kingdoms as China or America, you have to stop and ask, why am I doing that? Part of it is because our generation, and actually now it's our parents' generation, for many of us, were told that we were the final generation because we saw Israel become a nation again. But Israel becoming a nation is not on Jesus' list of signs for them to watch for. Look at the implication of moving the Great Tribulation into our future. Because many, when they first hear this, yeah, I hear you, there was a tribulation in the past, but that was just a foreshadowing of the real tribulation that's coming. But look at how the tribulation is defined in the Olivet Discourse. For there will be great distress or tribulation upon the land, and wrath to this people. Remember the you Jesus was pronouncing judgment on in Matthew 23. And they, those same people, will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations. The tribulation is one of the events that forced Israel out of the land in the 1st century. Now, if we move this into our future, This would have Israel being forced out of the land immediately after being regathered. But remember what Joel said about Israel after they were regathered this time. But Judah will be inhabited forever and Jerusalem for all generations. We're not looking for Israel to be desolated and scattered again. In fact, when we see nations come against Israel at the Battle of Gog and Magog, the nations are left desolate and Israel is upheld. The tables are turned and it's just the opposite of what happened in the first century. So this is one of the things that causes confusion in the futurist view. Proponents have to wonder, is Gog and Magog the same as Armageddon? Even though they seem different. Maybe Gog is the Antichrist, or maybe there are two battles of Gog and Magog, one before the millennium and one after the millennium. The confusion is because we've moved a prophecy related to the scattering of Israel into their time of regathering. So if we move things back into the generation Jesus and the prophets said it would happen in, we can remove all the props and scaffolding needed to hold up a purely futurist view. So this isn't about losing faith in what we popularly call the second coming. It's about putting faith in what the text is saying. For instance, when Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." We usually say, well, he's talking about the transfiguration in Matthew 17:2. But that's not when the Son of Man was going to come into his kingdom. Daniel 7 gives the vision. It says the Son of Man would come into his kingdom at the time of conflict between the 11th ruler and the Jewish people. So if you're looking for a fun study, hopefully you stick around. This will challenge you a bit and it'll cause you to look at the Old Testament and the New Testament with a fresh set of eyes. We'll bring in information not only from Josephus, but from the Dead Sea Scrolls and other texts. There's some very good evidence there as well. So if you need a place to start, here's a playlist that walks through the framework to show exactly how it all fits together. And again, feel free to ask any questions. Peace and have fun exploring all the extraordinary evidence.